Dust-choked cowboys didn't care who fed them, so long as the plate was full. In the roaring belly of the Iron Horse Saloon, they saw the heavy woman slinging hash as just another piece of furniture. Until a giant of a man slammed his fist down and demanded to know who baked the bread. The kitchen of the Iron Horse Saloon was a slice of purgatory, smelling of rendered pork fat, stale beer, and wet wool. At the center of it all stood Martha. She was a massive woman. She carried her weight not with the soft fragility of a pampered city wife, but with the dense, immovable gravity of a boulder. Her arms, thick as fence posts, were dusted with flour and speckled with a constellation of grease burns. She wore a canvas apron that had surrendered its original color years ago, tied tight over a faded gray dress. Sweat plastered stray strands of dull brown hair to her forehead, but she didn't bother wiping them away. Her hands were too busy. The saloon beyond the swinging wooden doors was a riot of noise. Miners, cattle drivers, and drifters packed the room, shouting over the out-of-tune piano, slamming tin cups against scratched mahogany. They were men hollowed out by the harsh Dakota territory, looking to fill the void with cheap whiskey and hot stew. Martha fed them. She chopped root vegetables with a heavy cleaver, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack sinking into the scarred butcher block. She hauled cast-iron pots that would have torn a lesser woman's shoulders from their sockets. She did it all in silence. Caleb Wyatt, the saloon's proprietor, pushed through the swinging doors. He was a sharp-featured man with a slick mustache and a pocket watch he checked too often. "Table 4 needs another round of beef stew, Martha," Caleb barked, stepping carefully to avoid a slick patch of spilled broth on the floorboards. "And don't skimp on the gravy. They're paying in silver dust." Martha didn't look up. She merely nodded, taking a ladle the size of a shovel head and dipping it into the simmering cauldron on the back of the stove. "Move it along," Caleb snapped, irritated by her plodding, deliberate pace. "They ain't got all night, and neither do I." He didn't say thank you. Nobody ever did. To Caleb and to the men out there drinking themselves blind, Martha wasn't a woman. She was an appliance, a workhorse. They looked right past her broad shoulders and wide hips, their eyes sliding off her as if she were covered in glass. Once, a drunken drover had stumbled into the kitchen looking for the alley door. He had knocked a sack of cornmeal out of Martha's hands. He hadn't apologized. He had just cursed the mess, kicked the spilled meal, and shoved past her, grumbling about the damn cow in the way. Martha hadn't cried. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to dry their tears. She had simply fetched the broom. She knew how the world saw her. She was 28, but the hard years had aged her eyes to a cynical, washed-out hazel. She harbored no illusions about romance or rescue. The penny dreadfuls left behind by traveling salesmen told stories of corseted ladies swooning into the arms of handsome sheriffs. Martha used those pages to light the stove. Her only solace was the alchemy of the kitchen. She turned away from the stew and pulled a heavy black skillet from the wall. She set it directly over the hottest part of the wood-fired range. She dropped a generous scoop of saved bacon grease into the iron. It sizzled instantly, spitting a rich, smoky aroma into the stifling air. While the pan heated to a blistering temperature, Martha mixed her batter. Rough stone-ground cornmeal, a handful of flour, clabbered milk she had traded a local farmer for, a pinch of salt, a dash of baking soda, and a single egg. She didn't measure. Her hands knew the ratios by muscle memory. She beat the mixture just enough to bring it together. Overmixing made it tough. When the grease in the skillet began to smoke, she poured the batter in. It hit the scorching iron with a violent hiss, the edges instantly frying into a crisp golden brown crust. She slid the heavy pan into the belly of the oven and shut the iron door with a loud clank. That was her pride. Not her face, not her figure, but the food. It was the only thing in her life she could control. If the men out there were too ignorant to taste the care baked into every bite, that was their loss. She fed them anyway. The weather broke bad just past sundown. A vicious wind whipped down from the black hills, rattling the window panes of the iron horse and driving needles of snow through the cracks in the door. The saloon quieted as the temperature dropped. The men huddled closer to the potbelly stove in the center of the room. Then the front doors blew open with a violent crash. The wind howled into the room, scattering a poker game and blowing out 3 lanterns. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had walked straight out of a blizzard's nightmare. He was immense. Taller than the doorframe, he had to duck to step inside. He wore a heavy coat of stitched buffalo hide, the fur matted with ice and snow. A thick, untamed beard obscured the lower half of his face, and his eyes, shadowed by a wide-brimmed felt hat, scanned the room with the casual wariness of an apex predator. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and raw, freezing earth. He didn't swagger to the bar. He moved with a heavy, terrifying grace, his boots thudding against the floorboards. The crowd parted for him instinctively. Caleb swallowed hard, pasting on a thin salesman's smile. "What'll it be, stranger? Whiskey? We got a decent rye." "Food," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant rockfall. "Hot. Right away. Stew and cornbread. 2 bits." The mountain man tossed a silver coin onto the bar. He turned and took a seat at a small table in the corner, his back to the wall. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't take off his hat. Caleb hurried to the kitchen doors, pushing them open just enough to stick his head in. "Martha, plate of stew, fast, and a big chunk of bread." Martha plated the food. The stew was thick, rich with marrow and root-cellared carrots. She pulled the skillet from the oven. The cornbread was perfect. The top was cracked and golden, the edges fried dark and crisp from the bacon fat. She sliced a massive wedge, steam rising from the yellow crumb, and slid it onto the tin plate. Caleb grabbed the plate and rushed it out. From her spot in the kitchen, Martha wiped her brow with the back of her wrist and picked up her cleaver again. Another slab of salted beef needed trimming. She heard the muted din of the saloon, the clatter of tin, the low hum of conversation resuming. At the corner table, Jedediah Boone picked up his spoon. He was starving. He had spent 3 days tracking a wounded elk through knee-deep drifts, surviving on dried jerky and melted snow. He took a massive bite of the stew. It was hot. It was hearty. Then he picked up the wedge of cornbread. He didn't shove it into his mouth like the miners did. He took a bite, chewed, and stopped. Jedediah looked down at the bread in his hand. He looked at the crisp, lacy edge where the batter had fried in the hot grease. He tasted the tang of the clabbered milk, the coarse, honest texture of the stone-ground meal. It wasn't sweet and cake-like, the way cheap outfits made it to mask rancid flour. It was savory, structured, and baked with an absolute, undeniable expertise. It was the best thing he had eaten in 10 years. He set the bread down, He pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, drawing the eyes of the nearest tables. Jedediah stood up, picked up his tin plate in one massive hand, and began walking across the room. He didn't head for the bar. He headed straight for the swinging doors of the kitchen. Caleb saw him coming and quickly stepped into his path, holding up a hand. "Hold on now, friend. You need more? I can get it. Patrons ain't allowed in the back." Jedediah looked down at Caleb. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He just stared into Caleb's eyes with a flat, cold intensity. "Move." Caleb hesitated, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Self-preservation won. He stepped aside, muttering, "Ain't nothing back there but the stove and the hog that runs it." Jedediah's jaw tightened at the words, but he didn't stop. He placed his massive hand flat against the swinging door and pushed it open. Martha had her back to the door, hacking a joint of beef apart. At the heavy thud of boots, she froze. Men didn't come into the kitchen. If they did, it meant trouble. She kept her grip on the wooden handle of the cleaver and turned around, her broad face set in a hard, defensive mask. She expected a drunk. She expected violence or a shouted complaint about a piece of gristle. Instead, she saw a giant in buffalo skin holding his plate. Jedediah looked at her. He didn't look past her. He didn't look at her with disgust or pity or the blank indifference she was so used to. He looked right at her face. He took in the flour on her apron, the sweat on her brow, the burn scars on her forearms. He saw the cleaver in her hand and the tension in her heavy shoulders. He looked down at the plate, then back up at her. "You make this?" he asked. The rumble of his voice seemed to rattle the cast iron pans hanging on the wall. Martha gripped the cleaver tighter. "I did. What's wrong with it?" Jedediah didn't answer right away. He reached up with his free hand and pulled the wide-brimmed hat off his head, revealing thick, dark hair plastered with sweat. He held the hat against his chest. "You heated the iron before you poured the batter," Jedediah said softly. "Bacon grease, smoked, not salted." Martha stared at him, stunned. Her grip on the cleaver loosened a fraction. "Yes. Stone-ground meal, kept the hull in, gives it a backbone." "Yes," she whispered, her voice gravelly from disuse. Jedediah looked at the remaining piece of bread on his plate. "My mother used to bake it like this, back in Tennessee. Haven't had it cooked right since I left." He looked back up, meeting her cynical hazel eyes with absolute sincerity. "It's a fine piece of work, ma'am. I just wanted to pay my respects to the hands that made it." Martha felt a strange, terrifying tightness in her chest. For the first time in her adult life, a man was looking at her and seeing something of value. Not a workhorse, not a joke, a craftsman, a person. She didn't know what to say. She swallowed hard, lowering the cleaver to the block. "Thank you," she managed to say. Jedediah nodded once, respectfully. He didn't leave immediately. He lingered for a second, his eyes tracing the tired lines around her mouth, seeing the quiet strength it took to survive in a place like this. "I'll be passing through again in the spring," Jedediah said. "I'd be mighty obliged if you were still here cooking." "I reckon I'll be here," Martha said quietly. Jedediah offered a small, rare smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He put his hat back on, turned, and walked out of the sweltering kitchen, leaving Martha alone with the heat of the stove and a heart pounding a new, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. She looked at her scarred, flour-covered hands. For the first time in years, she didn't hate them. She turned back to the stove, grabbed the skillet, and began mixing another batch, standing just a little bit taller in the smoke. The winter of 1888 didn't just arrive in the Dakota Territory. It slammed down like a coffin lid. For 4 months, the world outside the Iron Horse Saloon was a howling expanse of white. Inside, the air grew thick and sour. The men who huddled around the potbelly stove were trapped, their pockets emptying and their tempers shortening. They drank cheap potato whiskey and spit brown tobacco juice onto the sawdust floor, waiting for a thaw that felt like it would never come. Martha kept the fires burning. She hauled coal from the frozen shed out back, breaking the ice on the water barrel with the blunt end of her cleaver every morning. Her hands, already rough, split open at the knuckles. The lye soap she used to scrub the tin plates bit into the raw flesh, a daily stinging reminder of her place in the world. She bound her fingers in strips of ripped petticoat and kept working, yet something inside her had shifted. A microscopic fissure in the heavy, dull stone of her routine. It wasn't a sudden bloom of joy. Martha was far too pragmatic for that. But the stranger's words, "I just wanted to pay my respects to the hands that made it," had planted a stubborn, jagged seed in her mind. She started cleaning her favorite skillet with a little more care, rubbing it down with coarse salt and a rag until the iron gleamed black and slick. When Caleb ordered her to stretch the stew by throwing in a sack of cheap, weevil-infested flour, Martha quietly scooped the bugs out before the men could see. She didn't do it for the miners who ignored her. She didn't do it for Caleb. She did it because the man in the buffalo coat had recognized her as a craftsman. A craftsman didn't serve garbage. Caleb noticed the subtle change, and he despised it. He couldn't pinpoint what was different about his cook. She still didn't speak unless spoken to. She still moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a draft horse. But there was a newly forged rigidity in her spine. When he barked orders, she didn't flinch. She simply stared at him with those flat, hazel eyes until he felt the urge to look away. To assert his dominance, Caleb tightened the screws. "Rations are cut," he announced one bitter February morning, leaning against the butcher block and picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Beef is too dear. From now on, you serve salted pork ends and water down the beans." Martha didn't stop peeling potatoes. "The men work the hard rock, Caleb. Watered beans won't keep the cold out of their bones. They'll stop coming. They'll eat what I put in front of them," Caleb snapped, his face flushing. He hated the calm rumble of her voice. "And you'll cook what I tell you to cook. Don't go thinking you're something special just because a half-feral trapper humored you a few months back. You're a hired hand, Martha, and an ugly one at that. Nobody else in this territory would pay to keep you fed." He waited for the insult to land, waiting for her to drop her head in shame. Martha methodically carved a rotten eye out of a potato. The knife scraped against the cutting board. "Leave the pork ends by the stove," she said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. Caleb sneered, satisfied he had put her back in her box, and pushed his way out of the kitchen. Martha stood alone in the grease and the smoke. She set the knife down. Her hands were shaking, just slightly. It wasn't from sadness. It was a cold, slow-burning rage. For 28 years, she had accepted that her size and her plain face meant she had to swallow the world's abuse. She had believed she was lucky to have a roof, even one that leaked soot and smelled of stale beer. She looked at the heavy iron skillet hanging on the wall. She remembered the sheer, undeniable weight of the mountain man's presence, the quiet respect in his eyes. "I reckon I'll be here," she had told him. She picked up the knife again. The winter wouldn't last forever. April brought the thaw. The deep snowpack melted into a thick, sucking mud that swallowed wagon wheels up to their axles. The territory woke up. Cattle drives began moving north, and the Iron Horse saloons swelled with loud, muddy men carrying fresh wages. Martha was sweating through her canvas apron. The heat of the roaring stove clashed with the damp, mild breeze blowing in from the alley door. She was frying thick slabs of ham and flipping hotcakes, her movements a blur of practiced mechanical efficiency. The saloon was deafening. Someone was pounding on the piano, and two drovers were shouting obscenities over a spilled hand of cards. Suddenly, the piano stopped. The shouting died down. The noise of the saloon didn't fade. It was choked off, replaced by the heavy, ominous thud of boots on the wooden floorboards. Martha didn't look up. She flipped a hot cake. The swinging doors to the kitchen pushed open. The hinges groaned. Martha turned, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. Standing in the doorway was Jedediah. He wasn't wearing the heavy buffalo coat. He wore a canvas work jacket and a faded flannel shirt that stretched across his broad chest. His beard was trimmed closer to his jaw, and his dark eyes swept the kitchen before locking on to her. He looked leaner, hardened by the winter, but his stance was as solid as a redwood. He held a burlap sack in one hand. Martha felt the breath catch in her throat. She gripped her spatula, suddenly acutely aware of the flour dusting her nose and the dark sweat stains under her arms. Jedediah walked in. He didn't ask permission. He walked straight to the butcher block and set the burlap sack down. "I told you I'd be passing through," he said. His deep voice cut through the sizzling of the grease. "You did," Martha managed to say. Her voice was rusty. Jedediah opened the sack. He reached in and pulled out a bundle of fresh, pale green stalks. "Wild ramps," he said, laying them gently on the scarred wood. "Found them pushing up near a creek bed 3 days south of here. Strong flavor, good for the blood after a long freeze." Martha stepped closer, looking at the wild onions. They were perfectly intact, the dirt carefully brushed from their roots. He had carried them for days. Not furs, not gold dust. Onions. For her. "Thank you," she said softly. "They'll do well in the stew." "They aren't for the stew," Jedediah said flatly. "They're for you." Before Martha could process the words, the kitchen doors burst open violently. Caleb stormed in, his slick hair disheveled, his face purple with fury. "What the hell is this?" Caleb shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Jedediah. "I told you last time, no patrons in the kitchen. Get out before I have the sheriff haul you out." Jedediah slowly turned his head. He didn't shift his stance. He just looked at Caleb with the same cold, flat stare one might reserve for a rattlesnake in the path. "I ain't a patron today," Jedediah said quietly. "I'm here on business." "Business?" Caleb scoffed, puffing out his chest, though he wisely kept his distance. "You don't do business with her. She works for me. Now get out, or I'll dock her a week's wages for the distraction." Jedediah ignored Caleb completely. He turned his back on the saloon owner and looked directly at Martha. "I have a claim up on the Black Ridge," Jedediah said, his voice steady and low, meant only for her. 300 acres of good timber. Built a cabin tight enough to keep the wind out. Got a stream that runs clear all year round. Martha stared at him, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Why are you telling me this? Because a man can build a house, but it takes more than lumber to make it a life, Jedediah said. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. I live a hard life, Martha. It's quiet and it's unforgiving. I need a partner, not a servant, not a delicate thing to worry over. I need a woman who knows how to stand her ground, a woman who knows the value of hard work. He looked down at her rough, scarred hands and then up into her eyes. There was no pity. There was only absolute, unwavering respect. I'm asking you to come with me. The kitchen went dead silent, save for the spitting of the ham on the stove. Caleb let out a harsh, barking laugh. You're taking the cow? Good riddance. But she owes me for the month's lodging. She ain't leaving till I say she leaves. Jedediah finally moved. He turned, took 2 massive strides toward Caleb, and grabbed the man by the front of his vest. He lifted Caleb clean off his feet, driving him back against the wall with a sickening thud. Pots rattled on their hooks. She owes you nothing, Jedediah growled, his face inches from Caleb's terrified eyes. You owe her for every drop of sweat she poured into this slop house. You will keep your mouth shut, or I will nail it to the floorboards. He dropped Caleb, who crumpled to the sawdust, gasping for air. Jedediah turned back to Martha. He didn't push. He just waited. Martha looked at the stove. She looked at the iron skillet. She had spent years believing this grease-stained box was the only place she belonged. She looked at Caleb, cowering on the floor, a small, pathetic man who had held her captive with nothing but cruel words. Then she looked at the mountain man. He was offering her a life of toil, isolation, and harsh winters. It sounded like paradise. Martha reached up to the back of her neck. With steady, deliberate fingers, she untied the heavy knot of her canvas apron. She pulled it over her head and let it fall to the grease-stained floorboards. I have a trunk in the back room, Martha said. Her voice was clear, ringing with a strength she had forgotten she possessed. It won't take me long, Jedediah smiled. It was the same small, genuine smile he had given her months ago. I'll carry it. They didn't sneak out the back. Jedediah hoisted her heavy wooden trunk onto his shoulder as if it were empty. Martha walked beside him, pushing through the swinging doors into the saloon. The men fell silent, staring in disbelief as the massive trapper and the quiet, broad-shouldered cook walked straight through the center of the room. They stepped out through the front doors into the blinding spring sunlight. The mud of the street was thick, but for the first time in her life, Martha Higgins didn't feel the weight of the world pulling her down. She walked beside the mountain man, her head held high, stepping firmly into the thaw. If you found yourself rooting for the quiet cook and the mountain man who saw her worth, hit that like button and share this story with someone who appreciates a real, gritty romance. Subscribe to our channel for more untold tales of the Wild West, where the roughest exteriors often hide the warmest hearts. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. See you on the trail.